Hey folks, we're diving into another weird hybrid today, with today's topic being Lofty Sky Entertainment's Shuyan Saga. I say weird because this alternates between visual novel and brawler. So this does beg the question, was this narrative a knockout, or did Shuyan fail to go the distance? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Long ago, the Five Kingdoms had known peace, until the Guer attacked. Their destructive conquest of the countryside is spearheaded by their vicious overlord, Genbatar, a monster of a man who not only aspires to subjugate their citizens, but to crush the very essence of their guardian spirits that would protect those nations, consuming them with the aid of his own dread aspect, the Red Dragon. A campaign which puts him on a collision course with the kingdom of Nanfang, something which will irrevocably change the life of Shuyan, a tomboy princess who prefers the rigors of martial arts to the decorum of courtly affairs. A wish she's bound to receive in the worst of ways. Anyways, dramatic introduction aside, Shuyan Saga is geared towards fans of wuxia, a martial arts story with slightly over-the-top flair, and the overall execution is somewhat neat, being a comic book-esque visual novel. That said, I have to use some pretty heavy air quotes around the term visual novel, even if the Steam page does use it. See, while the game does provide a fair number of dialogue and action choices over the course of the game, there is only one that really tweaks the story in any manner, and even that just changes which character appears in a later cutscene without significantly changing the story which comes before or after. At the end of the day, Shuyan is more of a kinetic novel than anything, albeit one that has a rather particular quirk to it. And that's all the combat sprinkled into the mix. Occasionally, a conflict will crop up within the story, and you'll find yourself thrust into a fight for your life. This comes in two forms, the first being a top-down brawler, and the latter being a 1v1 encounter, which will occasionally mix in some QT-esque segments. For the brawler portions, it's simple enough. You use the mouse to move around the field, click enemies to combo them, or, once unlocked, initiate a special attack that briefly forces the enemy into a duel where they're defenseless. It's a fairly simple experience on the whole, though it is admittedly tricky on higher difficulties, since enemies not only hit harder, they also attack relentlessly, providing very few opportunities to retaliate and requiring you to master perfect blocking unless you want to empty your stamina bar and get comboed to death. At least until you get the parry, at which point most encounters become a foregone conclusion of redirecting people into walls until the fight's over. There is a dodge, but well, the number of times I got hit out of it or found myself getting stuck on an enemy or a piece of debris in the terrain was obnoxious enough that I often found it better to just move around, especially given that the inputs are janky. While everything is done at the click of a mouse button, there are occasionally times when an input winds up lagging, potentially not going through or somehow locking you into a heavy attack despite trying to combo light attacks. Not only is this unpleasant to deal with, it's compounded by those difficulty options I mentioned earlier. Namely, the simple fact that once you've picked one, it's locked in and requires you to restart the game from the very beginning to change it, even despite the game being broken into 3 different sections. Admittedly, you can skip the combat scenes, just like you can skip story segments, but there's a particular problem with doing so. Namely, where you would normally gain experience during combat that allows you to level up, and thus gain perks like extra health, extra damage, and more efficient special attacks, skipping ahead causes you to miss out on this, and there's no actual way to grind EXP you've missed earlier, which can cause some noticeable problems of locking you into a harder game experience on the whole. Really, the only silver lining to the process is that this lack doesn't apply to the skills you earn from advancing the story. This is a good thing, given how key they are to clearing the duel encounters. Well, mostly just the parry. See, early dueling is basically a back and forth between blocking at the right time until an enemy provides an opening, and then hitting the right spot, potentially chaining hits together to initiate a special attack. Rinse, repeat. That said, the later game segments will introduce unblockable attacks, requiring you to parry them instead, known as a greet for some reason. While this does potentially open you up to damage in a way a block doesn't, it's applicable to everything you encounter, eventually chains into counterattacks, and then finally becomes fuel for a special attack, making it the only thing you actually need to do in combat by the end of things. Oh, and speaking of additional abilities, you do eventually gain additional special abilities in the form of a damage boost and a heal, but these don't seem bindable to any button, despite the fact that there's a perfectly serviceable keyboard worth of them to choose from. This game is very clearly a phone port that puts the bare minimum of effort into making use of the system they were porting it to. You can't even move with the arrow keys or dodge with something like space or shift, even though that would have been incredibly helpful. Given all these flaws, it's a small wonder I managed to clear the post-game dungeon crawler mode, especially since it was locked into hard mode because of an earlier choice I made. What makes this mode especially interesting is the fact that you take control of a different character from the story, who plays somewhat differently from Shuyan, which is cool and all, except the game never tells you this and you have to figure out all of her abilities on your own, especially since she doesn't have a menu to hint at anything. Still, I will give it some credit, it actually has some unique encounters to the point that it has the most interesting brawling segments in the entire game, which isn't necessarily a compliment in hindsight. Also, there is an unlockable tourney mode, but this basically just boils down to a set of back-to-back duel battles with all of the notable enemies in the game. As an endeavor, it's okay, especially if you tackle it with whatever levels and story skills you currently have unlocked, which more or less makes it impossible to clear until you have the greet. Though inversely, it was very funny to be able to fight the last boss in this game mode and kick his teeth in well before I'd even reached the final third of the game. So yeah, weird experience so far. I can at least say that the comic book styling of the whole thing is neat, but even that has some flaws given the quality of the panels can feel notably different from scene to scene. Still, I enjoyed it well enough, just like the over-the-top voice acting. What can I say? I have some fondness for some good old Ham, and while some of the line delivery is just swell, Volker in particular just makes me think of Snidely Whiplash whenever he talks. Oh, and the music's fine. So yeah, this is Shuyan Saga in a nutshell, and on the whole, I honestly don't know. As a visual novel, I think it falls a bit flat. Your ability to make choices doesn't overly add anything meaningful, other than a singular scene which plays out almost identically, save for swapped characters. No extra endings and no different routes, and this bothers me. And this narrative quibbling extends to the temple adventures too, albeit for different reasons. See, while there's an intro and even brief storylines as you progress forward, it never reveals anything that changes or actually adds to the narrative. It's essentially an excuse plot patched into a certain segment of the game where it fit, and which does ultimately nothing except tell you everything you already knew. And mechanically, while I initially found the game to be an alright experience, it doesn't take long before it just becomes tedious. You have a very limited amount of tools to deal with the enemies that come after you, and in the Brawler segments, a very sparse variety to use them on, to the point that you don't even need one hand to count off what you'll need to adjust your patterns to. The dueling fares slightly better, but even this feels incredibly rudimentary. I played it once to see where the story would go. I fiddled with the combat to see if it would give better options, and ultimately, I spent chunks of the latter half of the game just being a bit bored. Would I recommend this to someone? I don't actually think so. I felt it was mechanically shallow, and while the narrative occasionally caught my interest, it just as quickly lost it through its myriad odd decisions. Which is why I actually feel this rate's not even a fumble, but an outright fail. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit the subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description. There's also a link to my Patreon if you want to see reviews early, or if you just want to support the channel. And to my merch house for neat swag like the Crit Hit coffee mugs. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.